Hello and welcome to another edition of Legislative Update here on Okemo Valley TV. My name is Tom Ayres. I'm the senior staff writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper in Woodstock. And as always, my guest for Legislative Update is Representative Charlie Kimbell. Charlie, good to see you.
Good morning, Tom. Great to see you.
Yeah, the legislative session is winding down, and as always happens during this wind down time period, controversy surfaces and differences of opinion surface. Governor Scott has expressed some trepidation in recent days about um, the lack of action on the part of the legislature, or at least the lack of action that's to his liking on the part of legislature relative to the housing crisis in the state. Can you talk a little bit about where things stand, Charlie, in both the House and the Senate with regard to housing legislation?
Sure. Thank you for that. Yeah, both the House and the Senate introduced very similar bills around housing, and the House passed one bill that's sitting over there in the Senate, and they're not actively deliberating that bill right now. They passed a bill into the House, and we are actively deliberating that now. So we're at the point where it's worked its way through two different committees. And we've got some amendments that are coming to that particular bill. The number is S-127. It is a housing bill and it has a lot of different components to it. But the main thing that the governor is focused on is this new CHIP program, which is tax increment financing for housing specifically. That's called the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program. And this is tax increment financing, which is extremely complicated, but it is to provide this kind of capture of property taxes that are paid on a new housing development to help pay for infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
such as water and sewer and roads and that type of thing, and also digital infrastructure that needs to be made to support that housing development. So it's a TIF, tax increment financing, but just for housing. So the
Mm-hmm.
controversy is the House Ways and Means Committee, the committee on which I sit. We put some restrictions on it, and the current version of our amendment that we passed out of our committee, and he's not happy with those. So that's the controversy right now.
I'm familiar with TIF from a commercial development standpoint. This is the first time I've ever heard about it from a housing perspective. I'm not saying it's the first time it's ever happened, but it's the first
Yeah.
time I've ever heard of it. What are some of the restrictions that you put on it that he's objecting to?
Well, there's the two big ones. The first one is the but-for test, and and that's related to anytime you're talking about using public money, like a tax increment financing district, you want to be sure that the development would not have occurred except for the use of public monies to encourage that development.
Okay.
So, and that's a big controversial piece that always with tax increment financing, because there's a theory that tax increment financing only makes it so that development occurs in an area that is specific, but it would have occurred somewhere else in the state anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are then foregoing revenue from the education fund, essentially from the statewide education property tax, then you are foregoing revenue from that education fund. So we're asking a but-for test to be applied to it, supported by the state auditor. Also, something that the state economists has suggested you really need to make sure that this is a development that would not have occurred.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first one, and it's really hard to measure. A lot of times it's subjective, but one of those things is that, perhaps the developer, in this case, it could be the municipality, it could be a private developer, has pursued every avenue of financing and has found that there's not enough financing available, or that the financing that they could find made the project too expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's the but-for test in this case.
Right. Right.
The, the second thing is that we put a dollar limit on it. there's a potential exposure to the ed fund for that same reason, that if that development would have occurred somewhere else and not subject to the retention of that increment taxes, um, so if not for that, then it could deprive the future revenues available for education financing and then increase that amount that other taxpayers would have to pay. So we said, all right, let's limit the exposure, potential exposure for the education fund of up to $14 million per year. And that's about twice the size of the existing TIF program that exists in the state. So 14 million a year, we want to limit it to that. But the way to get to this, that's the tax increment that's foregone. In order to translate that as to what the value is of the projects that could be approved in any one year, it's really confusing. So we said, Vermont Economic Progress Council can't approve more than 40 million in lifetime tax increment retention projects in any one year. So that sounds like you're limiting the total fund to $40 million. That's not true. So it's an incredibly powerful tool that even with that limitation, we think from numbers given to us, it could result in 2,000 to 7,000 new housing starts per year.
Wow.
And that's a
Wow.
lot. Yeah.
That raises a question of what defines development in terms of the number of units in a large building complex, or in a subdivision? Is it a certain number of houses or townhouses? Uh, what's the baseline for a development?
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's no baseline because in one area, a 10 unit development is going to be huge.
Hmm.
If you put 10 units in Reading or Plymouth, that would be enormous. But if you put 10 to 20 units in Burlington, I don't think anybody would even notice.
Hmm.
So it's a matter of figuring out what works financially.
I see.
When does it pencil out as to really incorporate that? So it's really looking at focusing on low, moderate, and middle income households. And middle income is up to 150% of area median income, and then low and middle or low and moderate is up to 80% or up to 120% of that income. So you're really trying to meet the housing need. And what we know is that there's not enough housing at any income level. But use of state dollars is really trying to figure out how to create housing that is in that affordable price range. That's what really we're trying to focus on.
Okay. Okay. Shifting away from the TIF issue and moving on to something else that the governor has expressed some consternation about, and that would be Act 250 expansion or extension of exemptions. How do the Senate and House bills address, if indeed they do, Act 250 issues, and how does that differ from what the governor's expectations are?
Well, this was a battle that was fought in the legislature last year over where would Act 250 exemptions be extended. And, in that bill that was passed last year and it's turned into Act 181, it extended temporary exemptions through January 1st of 2027 for a significant number of areas. It doesn't include Woodstock because Woodstock doesn't have permanent subdivision regulations. It has zoning, but not subdivision. So Woodstock is currently working on those, but it doesn't, it means that Woodstock development in our town is not exempt from Act 250. There are other towns that don't have any zoning at all, and so they're not exempt from Act 250. So those communities that would otherwise administer an Act 250 process have to have that ability to go through basically the Act 250 process
Hmm.
with a
Hmm.
developer. And a lot of towns just don't have that capacity. So I think the governor's looking again for more flexibility as to how to provide communities with that exemption from Act 250. in this bill that we're trying to move forward, we have an amendment coming through for S-127, in which we'll be removing all of the location criteria that is in the bill right now. You know, it was a little too cute as to how the bill was originally constructed,
Mhm.
as to say, we're going to look at providing this tax increment financing in areas where Act 250 exemptions are in existence through January of 2027, and then in these other areas. But at the end of the day, what we said is, let's forget about trying to manage what is permissible with land use and just talk about a financing tool. So that's what CHIP is. And I think the two have been conflated in discussions in the legislature, saying, well, you're now allowing me to build in a rural town. Well, yes, we are, but people had it confused with, is it an Act 250 exemption? It's fascinating. There's 248 designated centers in the state, and that includes village centers, designated downtowns, new town centers, neighborhood development areas. That's a lot, 248. I mean, even in a village center, Reading qualifies as a village center, got that designation. Woodstock has both the village and also Tassville. I think South Woodstock could probably qualify for that. So there's a lot of areas that would qualify as a settlement area, as a
Mhm.
designated center, where development could occur. But anyway, that criteria is being taken out of the bill with an amendment. Hopefully, people approve that.
Mhm. Mhm. I've heard a lot in covering housing issues over the years, particularly as it relates to um, communities outside of settled areas such as Woodstock Village, and certainly Plymouth and Reading, two of the other communities that you represent fall within that area is the lack of infrastructure
Yeah.
as a primary deterrent to new housing development. I've had the same conversations with folks at area housing organizations as well. Is part of the TIF approach aimed at fostering infrastructure development in communities where they don't currently have it?
Yes. Yeah.
It is.
Um,
Okay. Absolutely.
Perhaps not for the entire community. So it could be a large wastewater project that serves a new development without having to extend it throughout the whole town.
Uh-huh.
So there's something that's really important to note is TIF requires, tax increment financing requires that a town actually has come together and said, we want this housing to occur. What
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing in many communities is that even though there's a housing need, some towns have said, we know we need it, but we don't want to subsidize it. And we don't want to pay for this infrastructure. So it's really it's a hard discussion to have
Mm-hmm.
because not everyone is on the same page that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in Reading right now, they've got a project considering a community wastewater system that would serve the existing village of Felchville, which is about 70 homes.
Mm-hmm.
And, that has some risk to it. It has some price. And the question is who pays for it? Always comes down to who pays for it.
Right, right,
Um,
right. And
you
it's
know,
probably almost certainly way too expensive for those 70 homeowners in that Felchville area
yeah,
to swallow. So,
it could be. And so that's where, TIF or this type of project, CHIP, if you will, could help. It could
yeah,
help.
yeah.
But there has to be willingness of the town. And I think in Reading, there's a couple of camps there. There's those that we don't want to have our overall tax bills increase and it's got to stand on its own. And those are just saying, well, we could do some infill development and raise the number of housing units we have right in this area that'll help support it. So I think it's the best thing about tax increment financing. It does require the community together and say, yes, this is our plan and we really want to come together on it. So that's
Mm-hmm.
very helpful and beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Is there to kind of begin winding things down, is there a timeline in which the House expects to complete its work on S-127
Yeah,
uh,
that'll be this week. Yeah,
this week.
yeah, and that's was May 19th today. So May 20th we'll have an amendment out for consideration by the Appropriations Committee. And then to try to bring that to the floor maybe on Wednesday, as early as Wednesday, and try to get it through this week. And now is the time of conference committees. We talked about that last week, but they're starting to meet. The budget was approved by the conferees last week, sent to the governor. There are other conference committees on transportation, capital construction. There's one on tax credits. And then, of course, the education reform bill. So it's all this says that we aren't going to get out of there until, I'd say, the first week of June.
We had had that conversation previously too, and
Yeah.
uh, I was I, I was going to wrap things up by asking that very question. So, yeah, there's a lot left on your plate, and there's plenty
Yeah.
more for us to discuss over the course of the next couple of Mondays for sure. Uh,
Yes.
so. Well, Charlie, I really appreciate your taking the time to explain a fairly complex issue to our viewers, which is the whole tax increment financing structure and just the various pieces that you're all trying to put together into a comprehensive housing policy. So thanks for taking that time, and we'll continue to follow up in times ahead.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tom. Really
Uh,
appreciate it.
This has been another edition of Legislative Update with Representative Charlie Kimbell, collaborative production each week of Okemo Valley TV and the Vermont Standard newspaper. My name is Tom Ayres. Until next time, good day.